Think of a massive hemorrhage. The Iranian economy has bled out more than once. With the triple shock of sanctions, oil market collapse, and coronavirus, the COVID-19, to its system, it is in its third consecutive year of recession. Add a loss of water to the problems and you'll get the overall picture. The country is still standing, however, as with every challenge comes a chance. And the new government will be facing a flood of challenges, foreign and domestic, to turn around. Iran's first stroke, apparently mild but ground-setting, came towards the end of the Ahmadinejad era, when people saw their money devalued almost overnight by a double blow. As for sanctions, this country has been vaccinated against them by lighter doses over 40 years and more. And so it is ready to take whatever is thrown at it, but at the same time, it's been exhausted by constant blows. Which challenges must Raeisi take by the horns first? And which untapped chances can he grab? For answers, stay with me, Leila Faramarzi, on Iran Today. Mr. Kamali is Secretary General of the Islamic Labour Party. He worked with the Rafsanjani administration in a very different era. His challenge of choice would be,
you see, it's a matter of modernizing and rebuilding the economy. That is, pushing the economy toward competitiveness. Whatever activities being undertaken in the country must be done with the benefits and national interests in mind. We need to determine the layout and find out what can be done in which areas and how we can earn our revenue. The same goes for political issues. I've heard that Mr. Raeisi says he's willing to form a super-factional cabinet. This is laudable, as he's committing himself to using national capabilities.
To see the full half, Mr. Sorkhu lists all the good deeds he'd like to see done to jumpstart economic improvement. He is an analyst with reformist leanings and a construction engineer. And so, a favorite with him is housing. He's also a man of position with the welfare organization.
Constructing houses and buildings will activate some 150 other manufacturing industries. They should change the focus from building new houses in the suburbs and deserts. Something I noticed in Mr. Raeisi's plan, which is a good one, that was also an objective of the former government, but wasn't implemented due to a shortage of resources. They can instead focus their attention on using metropolitan areas with worn-out buildings. They are potentially suitable construction sites as they already have all infrastructures, including access, water, power and gas.
Given the array of problems, each branching out into more than one and finally automatically interconnecting as a web, allow me to just go through challenges or prospective chances in a linear fashion to wrap up in our given 25 minutes. But first, a mention of what was a winning card for the Rouhani government. That would be the JCPOA or nuclear deal of 2015 that limited Iran's nuclear program in return for sanctions relief and extensive foreign investment in this country. So you see, the Rouhani administration's grand plan could have saved the economy, except he put too much trust in the West, all his eggs in one basket according to principalists. And former US President Trump just pinned the nuclear deal on a whim in 2018, and he added to sanctions that were. Now add domestic corruption to that and you find Iran where it is. But that's not all on the president, as he is an executor of policies that are determined by the system as a whole. Inflation is always a biggie. It inflated further by this order. Sanctions stripped Iran of the bulk of its oil export revenues, so the country printed unbacked money. This unleashed liquidity in the market caused the local currency, or the rial, to drop further in value. And that gave us a fat lot of inflation. The rial depreciated 8-fold in 3 years and now stands at around 250,000 rials to a dollar. And the inflation rate reached around 50% in March-April 2021, its highest level in 3 years.
When there's no supply of goods, in other words, when there's no jump in production, liquidity would naturally lead to rising inflation. On the other hand, you can't refuse to increase people's salaries, as what they're being paid is the bare minimum to make ends meet. So what's the basic solution so the liquidity won't cause inflation? That's increasing domestic production and reforming monetary, banking and financial policies to benefit the producers.
The average rate of inflation in the last 12 months compared to its equivalent previous period reached 38.9%. The point-to-point inflation rate for essential commodities such as food and drinks reached 63%, while non-food goods and services increased by 43%. Mr. Sururi is chair of the Revolution Forces Coalition Council with similar priorities to Mr. Sorhu as a city council member. He squeezed in an interview with us after hours.
It's only natural to expect that Mr. Raeisi's most pressing challenge would be controlling, or put it in better words, managing the liquidity. It's a grave risk to Iran's economy, but I believe we can turn it into an opportunity with some insight. We should make the country attractive for domestic or foreign investors and eliminate the middlemen and prevent the huge force which is destroying everything on its path and causing the collapse of the economy. I think the country has great attractions that could navigate the liquidity to boost the economy.
With the Rouhani administration, foreign policy would have been a guiding light to the economy. Raeisi is also keen on reviving the JCPOA, or Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, with the 6 world powers. But his approach and foreign policy outlook have been quite different. While Rouhani's look was to the West, Raeisi is focused on neighbors and perhaps Russia and China relations. But how he times that and how situational and under control he keeps it is of great importance. Would you say now is the best time to reinforce relations with China and Russia, the way things have been going in Syria and with the Sputnik production line in Iran?
In my opinion, there hasn't been a serious synergy between our foreign policy, our diplomacy, and our internal politics. The government didn't act as a link between them. That's why we're acting like we're independent islands in terms of our domestic and foreign policy. This would result in our missing great opportunities.
Raeisi believes the priority should be resolving issues with Iran's neighbors before moving to the international level, and that can serve as a lever to pressure the US with the nuclear deal. Foreign policy in Iran is decided by consensus among key security and foreign policy institutions. And finally, it's signed off on by the leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. The leader had indicated he was in favor of reviving the nuclear deal. But all those years ago, when he had originally given the go-ahead, it was with a usual expression of vindicated distrust for the US. Raeisi did stress the national line in his first news conference since the election, saying he would not negotiate over Iran's ballistic missile program or its support of regional resistance groups. It is now to be seen who he finally picks out for the cabinet, especially foreign minister.
Even if there was no JCPOA, our wrong policies would lead us to this situation. The JCPOA is a political agreement that could be a prelude to coordination and constructive issues and put a stop to some of the harassment and obstacles the West had imposed against Iran. Of course, since they have problems with us due to cultural differences and the way they look at us, even if the JCPOA is restored and implemented, a fraction of the sanctions might be lifted, but the others imposed for human rights and missile defense programs would stay in place.
It's not just foreign policy affecting relations. Corona has taken a bite out of the country's economic balance and relations also. How this little bug might be handled henceforth as it surges as a 5th and 6th wave, our guests will explain.
We have to accept the coronavirus pandemic as a reality and plan the economy accordingly. In that regard, I think the pandemic has created an opportunity for us, although it has also led to catastrophes. We're a country that was, and still is, somewhat reluctant to automate tasks. But the pandemic has changed our perception, and we're now believing that traditional approaches can't respond to the changing times. I think we've made great progress in smartization in the past few years.
In November 2020, stricter health containment measures were introduced after Iran registered over 1 million COVID-19 cases and the death toll climbed to under 50,000 deaths. The measures have been reintroduced with each wave of the pandemic but haven't been stably maintained on the balance. Constraints are a necessary vice as the economic shock of the corona pandemic has pushed more households into poverty. To soften the shock, the authorities assigned new rounds of cash transfers and consumption loans for lower income deciles and households without a permanent source of income. Social assistance and COVID-19 healthcare will continue to add to government expenditure growth. There's plenty more to be said, but first a quick media review to give other outlets a chance to get a word in. Here's to put it in actual words. The Financial Tribune talks of foreign policy priorities. JCPOA Saudi ties should be top of foreign policy agenda in next admin. The incoming administration needs to put the state of the 2015 nuclear deal and Iran's ties with Saudi Arabia on top of its foreign policy agenda, according to an expert on international affairs. I think the future of the JCPOA is an important issue that needs to be determined, Hassan Beheshtipur said in an interview with ISNA. Resolving issues with Saudi Arabia is another top priority, according to Beheshtipur, since interaction with this country has an important impact on Iran's ties with other neighboring and regional countries. Iran and Saudi Arabia are two neighbors and two major regional powers which are rivals at political, security, and economic sectors, but can also cooperate with each other, he said. Mehr News tells of Raeisi's domestic priority. People livelihood, top priority for future administration. A large number of lawmakers in the Iranian parliament met with Ebrahim Raeisi, during which the president-elect stressed that people's livelihood will top agenda of his future government. Ebrahim Azizi, the lawmaker that represents the people of Shiraz in the Iranian parliament, said about the meeting between Ebrahim Raeisi and the lawmakers that in the meeting the MPs expressed their viewpoints on various and important issues in the country with the president-elect. Azizi said that a large number of MPs were present in the meeting with Sayyid Ebrahim Raeisi. The lawmakers said that in the meeting urgent issues that need to be resolved quickly were raised and discussed with Raeisi, adding that the possible ways to effective and constant interaction between the parliament and future administration were also discussed. Not to forget the importance of vaccines, Tehran Times has done a piece. Raeisi calls for speedy vaccination drive. President-elect Ebrahim Raeisi held a meeting with authorities and experts engaged in producing and distributing vaccines for the COVID-19 pandemic, urging an immediate action to vaccinate the citizens against the highly contagious virus. The meeting was attended by Health Minister Saeed Namaki, head of the Iranian Red Crescent Society, Karim Hemmati, chairman of the headquarters for executing the order of Imam Khomeini, Mohammad Mokhber, a number of lawmakers, the CEOs of producers of vaccines, managers of the institutions and companies working on the distribution of vaccines, and the vaccine program experts, Tasneem reported. The campaign against controlling the deadly virus should continue unstoppably, he said, adding his future government will prioritize allocating the necessary funds for vaccinating the citizens. Undoubtedly, what has been done so far in areas of vaccination has been necessary, but definitely not enough, he added. That would be it for this segment, but there's more to come, so do stay tuned. Time for a short break. We'll be back in no time. Ebrahim Raeisi came forth with quite a few economic slogans for his presidential campaign. How realistic and readily achievable those are yet to be seen.
Because we are a developing country, there is a lot of ground to cover. We can do so much work that if a day was 100 hours long instead of 24 hours, we'd still be running short of time. I'm exaggerating, of course, but there's a lot of work to be done and many facilities to do it with, from manpower to material issues, which are now being left unused.
To go back to the beginning of the problem, the GDP growth rate dropped to -6% in 2018 and -6.8% in 2019. This is while the inflation rate increased to 30.22% and 34.6% in 2018 and 19 respectively. Much of the decrease in the GDP, gross domestic product, was associated with the huge drop in oil exports. Over $62.5 billion in 2018 to $29 billion in 2020. In 2020, while the economy struggled with a high inflation rate of 36.5% amidst the coronavirus pandemic and ongoing US sanctions, the GDP started to recover. It grew to 1.5% after 2 years. However, given the ongoing political and economic challenges, the newly elected president will face difficulties in the economy and labor market, not to mention mismanagement and corruption.
Who owns what? Isn't everything all registered? Where do they publish this? Who has received loans? Some people receive money from banks and their names become classified. Who isn't willing to pay their debts? Who isn't paying taxes? All this means abetting the violators and a lack of transparency. If we are to act transparently, we need to continue all our activities within a glass room, so everyone can monitor the officials and be able to assess their performance.
Raeisi's first campaign speech was on May the 27th, and his promises were summarized in good governance to revive the Iranian economy. 7 broad promises were to give low-interest loans to poor households in the lower half of income distribution, to increase government subsidies for healthcare and decrease households' share in medical and health expenditures from 43% to 20%, to construct 4 million houses to create 4 million jobs, giving low-income people and graduates with tertiary degrees priority, and to decrease rents from 50% to 30%. How realistic these promises are, an expert tells.
I think the incoming government's policies towards building new houses are correct. The target of building 1 million housing units annually can potentially pull the brakes on the unbridled rise in the price and create a balance between supply and demand, ending this unimaginable situation for the housing sector.
Iran's political scene is pretty uniform now, with principalists dominating all 3 powers. Principalists basically claim it'll make it easier for them to take consistent, comprehensive economic decisions for economic reforms without in-house fighting getting in the way.
To get things done, when all 3 branches of the government think similarly, isn't an impressive feat. If a manager has access to 1,000 suggestions and can choose one among the many, he has done an impressive job. The more suggestions and ideas are at the manager's disposal, the better the decision would turn out. When we talk about the advantages of coordination, we are talking about the implementation of the plans. They should make the decision and then coordinate the efforts to implement it and move forward.
An effective pill for a suffering economy? Privatization, to eliminate rentiering and hoarding resources and to cause competition and create jobs. That's the idea, but not all resources are wise to fully privatize, and who gets to win enterprises as private investor is not easy to control.
According to the Constitution, the economic units and enterprises owned by the government should be transferred to non-governmental sectors. But this transfer also needs some considerations. The first and most important consideration is the competence of the people to whom these units will be assigned. Those who already work in the unit have the best skills to run them, because they are the ones whose livelihoods are tied to the growth and development of the production unit. And if they can get hold of the units in form of cooperatives and others, that could be the best case scenario.
With US sanctions came lower oil export revenues, and the government, we said, tried to make up for this by printing unbacked money. The government also attempted selling its shares in major Iranian enterprises on the stock market, to privatize, that is. But most shares sold on the stock market in the capital markets tend to end up in the hands of semi-state entities, and many of the shares crashed anyway. This is while the budget law of the year starting March 21, 2019 had foreseen a generation of $2.5 billion of revenues from privatization. Privatization has been on the agenda since the early 1990s, but Article 44 of the mid-2000s stipulates all major industries be dominated by the government. As such, in 2004, major figures, including the leader, agreed on how to withdraw the government from major economic activities. And the new interpretation of Article 44 defined the government's dominance through control over all regulatory entities, as well as a minimum 20% share for the government in all privatized entities.
We have adopted the wrong methods in the economy. If all wealth and riches of the world are poured inside Iran, the current economic formula would waste all that way. Money being lost, embezzlement and fraud are separate issues, but the current economic formula would destroy all that wealth.
Select industries remain under government monopoly, as it should be, I'd say. For example, upstream oil and gas and tobacco, as well as all regulatory entities such as the Central Bank of Iran, Central Insurance, the Civil Aviation Organization and Data Services Company of Iran. Also, select banks such as Bank Melli are exempt from privatization. On the balance, it would seem reducing the size of the executive branch to facilitate greater infrastructure investments and higher government efficiency can't have succeeded, seeing as the share of government companies in the overall state budget has grown from below 60% in 2005 to about 75% in the current Iranian year. One forecast goes as such that one of these two scenarios will emerge. First, that current privatization plans will be impossible to achieve, therefore leading to a greater budget deficit, which in turn will lead to greater inflationary pressures on the economy. And second, that the government, to achieve its own financial objectives, will have to transfer more of its assets to the semi-state sector. And this would change the balance or the partial balance between key power networks in the country. Regarding presidential promises, Raeisi has said that to reduce the price of essential goods in the domestic market, reliance on foreign currency resources must be minimized through achieving self-sufficiency in the production of essential goods. This is while he said he'd build 4 million housing units in the next 4 years. He has urged for a participatory policy in implementing his plans.
A leap in domestic production takes place when there's strong support, both qualitatively and quantitatively, for the producers. Let me give you a couple of examples. There's a specific need in the country for home appliances, which can be addressed either by importing goods or building them inside the country. If domestic production isn't responsible for the need, people would have to turn to foreign products, even if they are of lower quality. On the other hand, if the domestic product doesn't have any competition, like the car industry, the companies no longer feel the need to improve the quality of their products.
Investment priorities in the new government will matter much, both to reforming the situation the country finds itself in and earning credibility for Raeisi and the governing system. Principalists have long criticized their moderate rivals' failure in what they call growing the economy and improving living standards and livelihood. And Raeisi will have to deliver on promise of improvement.
There's been a lot of issues that have been destroyed people's trust. The public has lost all its trust. The government is facing problems in that regard. Suppose you want to rebuild social trust, but whatever the officials say, people regard it with skepticism. This is the worst situation any government can face.
To sum up with a look at foreign policy, the new president has no intention of giving up on the JCPOA, as the deal will result in the lifting of sanctions and some relief to the economy. But his greater confidence will remain in ties with the likes of China and Russia, who are also touched by direct US sanctions and are good investor prospects in Iran, provided domestic corruption and misuse of contracts is controlled. Also, Raeisi will avoid further confrontation with the GCC, as he believes oil-rich Persian Gulf states could be key for Iran's re-entry into international trade and financial systems. That'll be all for today. Thanks for watching from the whole team. Do join us again at the same times next week, as you never know what's on. Bye for now.